Okay, let's jump right in. When you picture India on the world stage, what comes to mind? For a lot of us, I think it's that incredible, vibrant culture, right?
Definitely. And the tech innovation hubs, the sheer scale of it being the world's largest democracy
Hmm.
and that huge economic potential.
Yeah, exactly. We've all seen the visuals, Bollywood's global reach, Indian food becoming ubiquitous, that whole incredible India tourism push.
And you can't forget the tech side. India's leaps there, things like its digital payment system, UPI, and the Aadhaar digital ID system, they've really made waves globally.
For sure, that image you're describing. For years, it felt like the dominant story. India, this rising power, confidently making its mark.
But while our deep dive into the material you shared, it reveals something. Maybe a little more complicated now. That picture isn't quite as steady as it might look from the outside.
Hmm.
We've seen signals, let's say, of turbulence,
Hmm.
some hits to that polished reputation coming from, well, recent diplomatic spats, questions around economic transparency, and even evolving political dynamics back home.
Right. So, our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack those signals. What did we find in this stack of sources that suggests maybe a shift in India's global image?
What's causing the wobble, essentially?
Exactly. What's causing it, and maybe most importantly, what does it all mean for you, the listener, watching this incredibly dynamic nation navigate the world stage?
We're going to dig into some complex stuff, definitely. But the goal is to make it feel less like a lecture.
Yeah, more like we're figuring out a fascinating kind of multi-layered story together.
Precisely. What we uncovered really points to this interconnectedness, how internal actions and external reactions are constantly shaping a nation's image. We found several key areas where this seems to have played out recently.
Okay, so where should we start? Maybe with diplomacy. It often feels like such a high-stakes dance on the global stage.
Good place to start. India has this long, long history of non-alignment, right? Trying to balance relationships with all sorts of global players.
But looking at the sources, it seems like that balancing act might have become, well, a little less graceful lately. Is that fair?
That might be putting it mildly.
Hmm.
The material highlighted a couple of specific instances that really seemed to test India's diplomatic footing.
Like what?
Well, think back to the India-Canada relationship in 2023. That really flared up.
Ah, right. Following the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar on Canadian soil.
Exactly. Canada's prime minister made very serious public accusations, directly linking Indian government agents to the killing.
And India's response was pretty strong, wasn't it? Calling it absurd.
Very strong denial. But the fallout, diplomatic expulsions on both sides,
Mm.
that definitely created some serious friction.
And did the sources suggest that's blown over now?
Well, what we learned from reports, even looking at stuff from as late as May 29, 2025, was that skepticism remained pretty high about any real reset in those ties. It seemed Canada's government, particularly the ruling party there, was still finding it hard to move past that whole controversy.
So lingering tensions. And it wasn't just Canada either, was it? Our relationship with the U.S., which is this absolutely critical strategic partnership.
Crucial, especially with shared interests in the Indo-Pacific.
That saw a moment of tension too, right?
It did, and it came from maybe an unexpected direction, an economic issue that ended up in the U.S. legal system involving a key partner.
You're talking about the Adani indictment.
Yes. In November 2024, the U.S. brought an indictment against Gautam Adani, a very, very prominent Indian business figure.
And the allegations were pretty hefty.
Substantial, yeah. Paying over $250 million in bribes, allegedly, to secure solar energy contracts worth something like $2 billion.
Wow. Now, the Adani Group denied all that, didn't they?
They did. They denied the charges. But the sheer fact that a major U.S. legal action was targeting someone seen as, well, very close to power corridors in India, that certainly raised eyebrows globally.
Yeah, you can see how that would complicate the narrative of this, seamless strategic partnership.
It's like suddenly finding there might be some hidden currents under what looks like a pretty solid alliance surface.
And speaking of complicated relationships, navigating West Asia is absolutely vital for India. That's another incredibly complex balancing act.
Crucial is definitely the right word. The Gulf nations, you're talking UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, they aren't just energy suppliers, though that's huge. They account for about 60% of India's oil imports.
Wow, 60%.
And they also host this massive Indian diaspora, over 8 million workers sending home vital remittances. So keeping strong ties there is paramount.
But then you have to balance those relationships with other players in the region, like Israel and Iran. How did that play out, especially recently?
Well, it proved incredibly tricky, particularly when the Israel-Hamas conflict escalated back in 2023.
India did call for peace and humanitarian aid, which seems like a standard diplomatic position.
It is. But we noted a fascinating observation in the material. A perception, perhaps, of reluctance from India to take a more definitive stance on the conflict's deep complexities.
How
Well, one diplomat quoted in the sources had this really memorable line. They described India as being like the guy at a party who agrees with everyone but commits to nothing.
Oof. That's quite a critique.
It is. And it kind of stuck with us, highlighting that challenge of maintaining strategic autonomy in a world that increasingly, it seems, expects nations to take clearer positions.
Yeah, that non-aligned stance gets harder to maintain when things polarize. So this diplomatic dimension, it clearly shows how specific incidents, even if they're denied or contested legally, can start to chip away at that carefully built global image.
Exactly. Now, maybe we should pivot to the economic sphere.
Yeah.
Because that's another area where the picture seems, well, more nuanced than it might first appear.
Okay. I mean, India's economic story since the reforms back in '91 is undeniably impressive, right? It's been one of pretty rapid growth.
Absolutely. And you see projections confidently saying India could be the world's third largest economy by 2030. That's huge.
You see the evidence, too, in places like Bengaluru and Hyderabad, these vibrant tech hubs. And the success of those digital systems we mentioned earlier, UPI, the payment system.
Which is incredibly popular and efficient.
And Aadhaar, that unique biometric ID, that's the narrative, isn't it? The dynamic growth engine.
That is the narrative. But as we dug into the sources, we also found stories that, well, complicate this picture a bit. They introduce elements of uncertainty.
Like the Adani indictment again.
Yes, that indictment we mentioned. Beyond its direct legal implications, it became a pretty significant PR challenge for India, didn't it?
How so, beyond the obvious legal side?
Well, when allegations of that scale, involving a figure seen as so closely linked to the corridors of power, come to light, it inevitably raises questions internationally about transparency, about governance.
Right. And didn't the sources mention something about where these stories often break?
That was particularly telling, yes. The point made was that these major disclosures often seem to originate abroad, rather than coming from deep, independent investigative journalism within India itself.
That detail feels significant, doesn't it? It suggests maybe major economic controversies are breaking outside the country before they're really fully explored domestically.
It raises questions, certainly, and this transparency issue also seemed to connect with concerns we saw regarding data credibility.
Ah, the data issue. Tell me more about that.
Absolutely. A really striking example discussed was the data surrounding COVID-19 deaths. India's official figure was around 5.33 lakh fatalities. Quite specific.
Okay.
However, the World Health Organization, the WHO, they estimated a much, much higher number, closer to 47 lakh excess deaths during that 2020-2021 period.
Wow, that's a massive difference. How did the government respond to that discrepancy?
We saw that the Indian government reacted quite defensively to the WHO's estimates, questioning their methodology.
And as you pointed out earlier, accurate, reliable data is just fundamental for everything, isn't it? Public health, economic planning, international trust.
It underpins so much. And the argument we encountered in the material was that when data appears to be fudged, or even if there's just a perception of it being managed for optics, it makes the whole economic success narrative feel, well, less like a clear report and maybe more curated than candid, as one source put it.
Curated rather than candid. That phrase sums it up well. It introduces that note of skepticism, even when you have these really impressive top-line growth figures.
Exactly. So this complexity in the economic story adds another layer to India's global image. It moves it beyond just a simple story of rapid growth to one that also includes these questions about underlying transparency and data integrity.
Which brings us neatly, I suppose, to India's democratic identity. That's so central to how it presents itself to the world, isn't it?
Absolutely central. India has often embraced this idea of being a Vishwaguru, a world teacher or leader.
And a big part of that is its status as the world's largest democracy-free elections, historically a vibrant press and independent judiciary. That's core to the brand, so to speak.
That's certainly the aspiration and largely the reality for a long time. But the sources we examined also presented a kind of counter-narrative, highlighting concerns about what some observers are describing as democratic erosion.
Erosion? In what way?
Well, reports from organizations like Freedom House and VDem, which track democracy globally, have pointed to what they see as a rise in authoritarian characteristics and challenges to civil liberties and media freedom in recent years.
Okay, the media freedom aspect seems to come up quite a bit. That sounds like a key point of concern in the sources.
It did seem prominent. We saw an editorial reference from 2025 that described the government's focus on image control. And it suggested these efforts weren't just domestic, but extended beyond India's borders to try and shape international perceptions.
All right. And what about domestically? How is that playing out?
Well, domestically, you see discussions on social media platforms like X, for example, often reflecting this tension. We even came across this quite sarcastic description of some sections of the Indian media
Uh-oh.
as the world's freest stenographers.
Ouch. That's a powerful phrase. It paints a picture of a press that's maybe less independent, perhaps more aligned with the official line than that image of a vibrant democracy would suggest.
It's a stark critique. And the sources suggested that when journalists face legal pressure, or maybe even just resort to self-censorship to avoid trouble, it naturally raises questions globally about how robust that vibrant democracy tag really is.
And this also seemed to intersect with concerns about majoritarianism.
Yes, that came up too. We saw discussions about the rise of Hindu nationalism, and one particular editorial, this one from May 17, 2025, which issued a really strong warning. It said that India's democratic and secular fabric has frayed.
Frayed. Strong word.
Very strong. And what was particularly striking about this editorial, according to the analysis, was that it actually drew comparisons between India's current struggles with radicalism and Pakistan's historical challenges in that area.
Wow. That's a comparison India typically really avoids, right? And probably finds quite sensitive.
Extremely sensitive. So making that comparison publicly in an editorial is quite significant. It shows how these deeply domestic political and social dynamics are clearly having an impact on how India is perceived internationally as, a democratic model.
Okay, so we've touched on diplomacy, economy, democracy. What about soft power? India seems to have that in spades through its culture.
Oh, absolutely. India's cultural influence is massive and, frankly, undeniably positive globally in many ways. Just think about the success of Bollywood films like RRR winning an Oscar.
Great film.
The widespread adoption of yoga worldwide, or how Indian cuisine is a global phenomenon now. This cultural soft power is a tremendous asset, no question.
I sense a but coming.
Well, the but we found in the analysis is that this soft power, while really significant, can't completely shield the nation's image from the fallout when other issues, political controversies, economic problems gain international attention. Especially things like religious intolerance or stark economic inequality, if those make headlines.
So it's like having this incredible music and dance happening on stage, but the audience is also kind of aware of other stuff happening backstage that isn't quite as appealing.
That's a good analogy. And another critical element of India's global connection is its huge diaspora, right? Over 32 million people living abroad.
Many incredibly successful, especially in places like the U.S.
Exactly. And the government has actively courted and engaged with this diaspora. It sees them as a bridge.
But our analysis suggested that when these controversies pop up, like the Adani indictment we discussed, or the Nijar case in Canada,
The diaspora can find themselves in a pretty difficult position. They're sort of caught between their connection and often loyalty to India and the increased scrutiny or uncomfortable questions they might face in their adopted home countries.
it puts them in a sensitive spot. A bit of a lightning rod, as one source maybe
That's
hinted.
a good way to put it, yes.
No.
A lightning rod.
Yeah.
And maybe let's loop back quickly to the Gulf connection, but look at it from the image perspective this time. We've talked about the economic necessity, the energy, the remittances. Huge. But the optics of this relationship are also increasingly important for India's global standing.
Right. India has been deepening those ties, signing major trade deals, defense pacts with the UAE and Saudi Arabia in 2023, 2024.
Correct. They're investing heavily in those relationships.
Yeah.
But what we found was this kind of cautionary observation. If India's overall global image takes hits, maybe due to reports or concerns about human rights or domestic instability, it could potentially risk alienating these Gulf nations. Because remember, they are actively diversifying their own economies, building relationships with lots of global powers, including China.
So they have options.
They have options. And the takeaway here seemed to be the need for India to keep the charm on and the drama off in that crucial region, as one source rather colorfully put it.
Keep the charm on and the drama off. That really captures it, doesn't it? It highlights how a nation's internal situation, its perceived values, are increasingly becoming factors in how reliable or appealing it is as an international partner.
Absolutely. So, okay, Given all these challenges we've unpacked, diplomatic stumbles, economic question marks, democratic concerns, what did our deep dive suggest about how India might navigate them? How could it manage its image better going forward?
Well, we saw several potential pathways discussed in the material. One really clear theme was the need for greater transparency, just being more open.
Open about what specifically?
Whether it's being upfront about sensitive data, like those COVID-19 figures we talked about, or shedding more light on major economic dealings, there seems to be a call for building trust simply through more accountability.
Making the reality match the rhetoric, essentially.
Exactly, making the reality match the aspiration. Another area highlighted was the need for maybe sharper, more proactive diplomacy.
Meaning?
Meaning, while strategic autonomy is important, maybe just being non-committal or purely defensive isn't always enough in today's world. Engaging more directly, even when facing tensions with partners like Canada or the US, could actually project confidence and a willingness to work through the difficult issues.
Rather than just stonewalling or issuing denials.
Right. And maybe offering some reciprocal gestures, things like trade incentives or cultural exchanges that go beyond just the standard talking points. Third, there was a really strong argument made for empowering the domestic media.
Ah, back to the media. That's interesting. How would that help the global image?
Well, the point we gleaned was that allowing journalists within India the freedom to investigate and report without fear of reprisal is actually seen not as a threat, but as a global asset.
How so?
Because stories about challenges or controversies that originate from within India, reported by Indian journalists, tend to carry more credibility internationally than those that break first abroad, may be seen as having an agenda.
Ah, I see. So a truly free press can actually help manage a nation's image paradoxically by addressing issues openly and proactively from the inside.
That was the argument. And finally, well, doubling down on amplifying India's genuine soft power strength.
The positive stuff.
Exactly. Promoting its incredible tech innovation, its depth cultural diversity, its contributions to global well-being, like its vaccine diplomacy during the pandemic, which was significant.
The narrative here being that the world does respond to a positive story, and India certainly has plenty of material for one.
Provided it doesn't get consistently overshadowed by these unresolved controversies or questions.
Makes sense. So bring it all together then.
Right.
Why does this dynamic, sometimes complicated picture of India's image really matter to you, the listener?
Because, as the sources underscored, a nation's reputation isn't just some abstract concept, right? It has very real, tangible consequences.
How so?
It directly impacts decisions about foreign investment, where companies put their money. It affects the flow of tourism, where people choose to visit. And ultimately, it shapes India's influence and leverage in global forums and international negotiations.
Right. In a world where you have various powers competing for influence, jostling to shape the global order, how India is perceived, and crucially, how it handles these image challenges is critically important, both for its own future and, frankly, for the wider international landscape.
Definitely. And despite all the headwinds and challenges we've discussed, the sources were also careful to remind us of India's fundamental strengths.
Which are considerable.
Immense. Its massive young population, its proven technological capabilities, that incredibly rich and diverse cultural heritage we talked about. The situation isn't really presented as some kind of irreversible decline.
No, more like a wake-up call, perhaps.
Exactly, a wake-up call. A moment of undeniably high stakes, yes, but also one that presents immense potential. India absolutely possesses the core assets to navigate these challenges and potentially reinforce its position as a really significant global player.
It sounds like a complex, ongoing process of alignment, trying to align those internal realities with the external aspirations and perceptions.
I think that sums it up well. This deep dive has really shown us the layered, complex picture of India's global image today. We've explored those specific challenges highlighted in diplomacy, the economy, its democratic identity.
While also pointing towards some concrete ways these issues could potentially be addressed, based on the analysis we looked at. India certainly has the capacity, the potential to tackle these complexities.
And leverage its undeniable strengths for a stronger global presence moving forward.
For sure.
So maybe here's something to ponder as we finish up. In our incredibly interconnected world today, how inseparable have a nation's internal dynamics, its politics, its economy, its social issues actually become from how it's viewed on the world stage?
That's a great question.
And what does it really mean for a rising global power like India to live up to its own aspirational image, not just through rhetoric, but through transparent realities? It's a question I think that lingers long after you look through these sources.